carbon dioxide transport, it's much more complicated because there are three options for how it gets transported in the blood. Most of it, 70% of it, is going to be converted to carbonic acid in that equation that we've been talking about. So CO2 plus H2O, just get used to writing it, HCO3, sorry that's supposed to be a C, plus hydrogen. So most of it, 70%, after it diffuses into the red blood cell, so 93% diffuses into the red blood cell, 70% gets converted to carbonic acid and then dissociates into hydrogen and bicarbonate ions. So most of the hemoglobin actually gets transported by that conversion. 23% will bind directly to hemoglobin and form carbamino hemoglobin. And this actually reduces the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. So just keep that in mind. 7% of it just remains out here in the plasma, dissolved. Now the other thing that you should note down here is that this is the chloride shift. And what happens is when hemoglobin gets converted to carbonic acid and then hydrogen and bicarbonate ions, chloride from the plasma comes into the red blood cell and the bicarbonate ion shifts out. And this allows the carbon dioxide to stay in this form of bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions until it reaches the lungs. So again, this is the equation you need to know. CO2 plus water gets converted to carbonic acid, which will automatically make hydrogen ions, which affects the pH, and bicarbonate ions, which is an excellent buffer. Hydrogen actually gets buffered by the hemoglobin, meaning it binds to the hemoglobin. And when it does that, it makes hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen go down. And that is what the Bohr effect is. And then the bicarbonate ion is exchanged for intracellular chloride in the chloride shift. So here, this is the plasma. These are the tissue cells. So carbon dioxide is picked up in the tissue. So picked up in the tissue, so here's the CO2. So it goes in from the cells that generated it into the interstitial space, and then it's going to cross into the plasma, and 7% will just stay dissolved in the plasma, just like that. However, most of it, 70% or so, is going to enter the red blood cell, and it's going to, through that equation, be converted into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. And bicarbonate ions, by shifting with chloride in the chloride shift, are going to be transported through the blood plasma until they get back to the lungs in this form. Some CO2 will bind directly to hemoglobin, creating carbamino hemoglobin. And hydrogens made from the conversion to carbonic acid of carbon dioxide are actually going to bind to hemoglobin as well. And it's this buffered hemoglobin that binds to the hydrogen ions, that is responsible for the Bohr effect, meaning that at elevated levels of CO2, hemoglobin has lower affinity for oxygen at a given partial pressure of oxygen. This blood is going to travel back around through the veins and to the lungs. And when it gets to the lungs, the whole process reverses so that CO2 gets ejected into the alveoli. So the chloride shift reverses, so chloride goes back out of the red blood cell, the bicarbonate ion goes back in, and then the whole system goes backwards to generate CO2, which gets ejected into the alveoli and can be breathed out of the body. Oxygen, of course, is entering. And when oxygen enters, it's going to bind, kicking off the hydrogen, and that will, of course, add with the bicarbonate ion and create CO2. Carbaminohemoglobin releases its CO2, which goes out, and then CO2 dissolved in the plasma goes out. There is a small amount of this reaction taking place in the plasma as well, but it's much slower.